Hi, everybody. And today we are going to be talking about telecoms compliance in the US and around the world. How does that impact the enterprise and the things you need to know to be aware of about things that are coming down the line. First thing we'll do is go through a quick agenda of the items that we are going to go through today. The first item that we're going to talk about is the hidden impact of non-compliance. Briefly, that's the aspect of compliance that most enterprises won't have considered before because it will have been hidden behind their telecoms purchase. Then we're going to go into some of these specific requirements around the world. We're going to look at some specific detailed requirements in some specific countries and how you should navigate those. Then we're going to look at how you can manage the regulatory and compliance world effectively without causing your business to slow down. And the next steps that you need to take to ensure that you're essentially using a compliant telephony service. So without further ado, I will talk to you a little bit about who Bandwidth are. So Bandwidth are a cloud-first, cloud-native CPaaS provider, providing connectivity and telephony services into over 60 countries worldwide, with the ability to offer full-stack PSTN replacement style services in 38 plus countries, holding the status of national operator in 31 plus countries around the world. This is all bundled together with our substantial US in-the-ground capabilities, which has led to us being trusted by some very well-known household names that you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. So, are you the enterprise going global? Have you already gone global? Are you thinking about it? What stage are you at on that journey? Whichever stage you're at, you will need to know about regulations and compliance. Across the globe, regulations differ. In countries like the US, you might be familiar with things like Ray-Barnes Act and Carey's Law. Internationally, there are different things, there are different regulations that you need to be aware of, which have been brought to bear by the turn down of traditional TDM style services. Each country invariably has a different and specific set of regulations that you may need to comply with. So let's have a look at some of the key points that we've got listed out on the slide today. So the Great Cloud Migration. Businesses are at varying stages of their digital transformation journey. And in this digital transformation journey, they're inevitably going to have a look at their telecom stack. Largely driven by the recent worldwide events that have forced a lot of people to have to work from home. A lot of enterprises have been forced really quickly down this digital transformation journey. And some enterprises have had to make quick decisions regarding their telecom stack so that they can maintain communication between their employees. Some of this is good, some of this is bad, some of this has led to ramifications and things that need to change. We're going to talk about some of that today. Local compliance requirements. As I mentioned earlier, each country invariably has a completely separate and distinct set of regulations. It would be a misnomer to assume that the US has got one set of regulations and Europe have got another. That would be a wonderful world if that was the case. Unfortunately, every single country around the world has got its own regulatory body who is responsible for setting the rules and regulations in those countries and how they pertain to the telecom services that we are all consuming. It will pay dividend to the enterprise to be aware that these exist and at least approach with a quizzical nature towards your telecoms provider. How are you solving for these problems? As I mentioned before, a lot of enterprises have been forced into the working from home or hybrid work mode. This has caused a lot of enterprises to make knee-jerk decisions and end up with telecoms offerings that are not necessarily fit for purpose. In some cases, we've noticed that enterprises have been pushed onto platforms that are not necessarily operating in a compliant fashion. It will pay dividends to know what these are. As you're moving through modernizing your tech stack, you should consider the potential of unbundling and modularizing the way that you consume telecoms. This way, you can be certain that at each stage of the purchase, you are procuring from a regulatorily compliant party, and this gives you the flexibility to swap out a bad component or a bad part or someone who you just don't like the look of at that point in time. Either way, it gives you the ability to be much more flexible as we go through changing times in the telecommunications environment. So now we're going to go into a quick poll.
Okay. All right. Okay, there we go. We advanced the slide. So thanks very much. And here's our first question. Are you aware of France's number authentication mechanism, or MAN program, established to lower telecom fraud? Yes, you're aware of it, but don't know what it means. Yes, you do know about it. No, let's find out a little more, or no, and I guess what's that? No, not aware of. And that's a really interesting point that you were making, I think, Bennett, is that we tend to think that, maybe especially with Europe, because you have the European Union, you tend to think, well, there's got to be some commonality there, but it really, when you get to actually deploying sites, it's country by country. It's not region by region. Do you think that enterprises kind of come into the process understanding that, or is that kind of a first sort of wake up call?
I am yet to find an enterprise that has walked into this conversation knowing everything about all the regulations. Normally, the way that these conversations start is an enterprise has heard one thing in one country, starts scratching away at it, and then goes, oh, wow, there's a lot here. I need to find an expert to talk to. And it's normally at that point that they stumble across Bandwidth, or we reach out to them, and then we break into a more in-depth conversation.
Okay, well, let's show you the results here so we can move on. Looks like there's some education that can be done, and an awful lot of people who could use some information on this particular regulation. So with that, I'll leave this up, and then Bennett and Robin, you can move it when you want or discuss the poll. I'll turn it back to you.
Well, because loads of people have said they don't know what the MAN program is, I kind of feel obliged to talk about it for at least 10 seconds. And then I'll hand over to Robin to carry on this excellent show. So the MAN program is effectively equivalent to what STIR/SHAKEN is in the US, but for France. So it's an attestation mechanism that operators will be compelled to comply with, and that has impacts on the enterprise. We have historically seen regulation changes in France catch some suppliers off guard, which has led to enterprises losing service in France because the reseller or the integrator or whatever didn't move quick enough with the regulation to pivot their platform to support it. It's important that you're having these conversations. My suggestion would be just reach out to your supplier, whoever they are, and ask them what their MAN program mitigation plan is or anything about it. And if they give you a confused look, ask some more questions.
Perfect. So I'll begin by saying I think I always like to look at regulatory and compliance issues from three facets or three perspectives. There's the core voice perspective. There's funding and billing perspectives, and then there's emergency calling perspectives. And we're going to talk about all three of those perspectives as we go through this conversation here today. But first and foremost, there's a lot of confusion around compliance with these different aspects of and perspectives of regulations and so forth, and what do they mean? And one in particular is this emergency calling perspective. And there's different perspectives around the world, right? You look at the U.S. and then you look at things like different countries internationally and so forth. There's a lot of different perspectives, but one quick story and one quick aspect that we can talk about is relative to the U.S. So Metrigy did a great study earlier this year, and they did a survey and some research and showed that only, and I'm going to use the word here, only a little over half of companies believe they are compliant with some of the latest U.S. regulations for emergency calling. A lot of us, a lot of you heard of the term Kerry's Laws and Raybaum's Act, or Kerry's Law and Raybaum's Act, and what those MLTS regulations coming out of the FCC mean. And it's interesting that these laws, right? Everything is fully in effect right now, but the FCC has passed these regulations and the deadlines have come and gone, but we still have only a little more than half the companies believe that they are compliant. This is only a couple months old, these data points. And a lot of questions are coming out about this. Must these old phone systems be upgraded? How do these interplay with things like the other regulations, the funding I get for this? It's an unfunded mandate. How do I pay for this? And then we get into the nitty gritty details of emergency services, especially in the United States, which is, what is a dispatchable location? What are the requirements for all the different devices I might have on my network? And we talk about them in terms of dividing them up in different use cases and different scenarios. The bottom line is that it is a complex problem, and it's been exacerbated a lot in the last several years by people taking their phones and going home. Matt mentioned that a little bit earlier, that we've got these, there's a changing environment, especially as companies and organizations move towards the cloud. You've got not only changing infrastructure and changing aspects of the ways they do things from on-premise towards cloud-based solutions, but then you also have these hybrid technologies and hybrid workforces. Some companies are using multiple different types of telephony systems, or for example, PBXs. You throw Microsoft Teams into it. There's all kinds of things going on there where Microsoft Teams is introducing new complications and things, but still the need remains to solve this on a global nature. And it's good to look. You've got to look at it locally. You've got to look at your particular area for your network, and especially if you have a network that spans countries and spans things. Sometimes you have to look at it country by country instead of just globally at the whole network. And look at things from that perspective. So there is some confusion that exists over all this meaning of compliance and what we've got to do. And when you look at compliance in the U.S., right, there's aspects of how do I solve for 911, but also stir shaking and all these other things. And then you go internationally, how do we solve for it internationally? It's a different animal in how we manage those things. So I'll invite Mehmet to add anything more onto this here in a second, but that's the gist of this is compliance throughout the environment, and I think this is a good diagram here that shows you, a perspective, a sliver of how, what people think in terms of this compliance and where we're at, and you'll see there, if you don't think you're compliant, you're not alone. So, anything to add, Mehmet?
Sorry, I nearly choked on my own words there. So I totally agree. As I said earlier, I'm yet to find an enterprise that is using fully compliant services everywhere in all aspects and has absolutely nothing to worry about. Now, that might sound scary, but it's not as bad as it seems. There's normally quite a straightforward path to remediation, and the rules and regulations are well understood by the experts in the industry. So although there is some confusion over the definition of compliance, and it definitely does change depending on which geography you look at the word compliance through, there are experts out there that can help demystify whatever this is.
And I think it's unrealistic. If you think you're going to become an expert, listener, if you think you're becoming an expert, don't think that. The good news is you don't have to be. You've got the Mehmets of the world, you've got the Robins of the world to help you. And that's what we're here for. That's my job. My job is to help our customers and our prospects understand and navigate these complex waters. And it impacts all aspects of your business, right? I mean, we've touched on a lot of these topics already in terms of international scalability, everything from, to the other end of experiences, your end user and your agent experiences, and everything in between. There's a lot of aspects of this that impact your business, and you got to keep tabs on. And again, the good news is you've got somebody like Bandwidth, you've got experts like us out in the field that are there to help you navigate through this. These are just four of several examples of things to keep in mind as you navigate through this process. Scalability, not just internationally, but also within your network itself, there's scalability issues to consider, business continuity, disaster recovery. There are, it depends on your locale. There are regulations and compliance around disaster recovery and business continuity that you might need to take into account. My expertise is emergency calling and that sort of thing. And so we'll talk about that in more detail as we get through this in terms of Ray-Baum's Act, Kerry's Law, and how, quite frankly, I'm seeing that expand. I'm seeing more and more customers come to us and say, hey, Bandwidth, we're doing such a great job in the U.S. and in some of these other countries. How do we take that into our global network? We want to be proactive and do that, and so on and so forth. So this is a key thing, to what we're doing. So now we're gonna transition on, and let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'll hand it back to you, Mehmet.
So, like I said earlier, lots of countries got lots of different rules. What we're going to look at now is the number activation flow for two countries that are very close by, France and Germany, inside Europe, that most people would wrongly, unfortunately, assume that the regulations are the same, that the workflows are the same. They're not. They're very different. So let's have a look at what they are. So in France, fixed numbers and non-fixed numbers. Some people might refer to non-fixed numbers as mobiles, but it's a specific classification in France. For fixed numbers, then end user data must be provided. It's the person who's going to be using the phone number or the organization. A local office location must be had in order to obtain a fixed line number in France. You must provide proof of your address and proof of ID. For non-fixed numbers, it's slightly different. You need to provide a copy of your ID and passport. You need to provide a full address and your full name. This is a particular set of requirements, not particularly difficult to comply with and nothing really overbearing. But if we have a look at Germany, you can see that it's slightly different. That now we're looking at a classification of geographic versus national numbers, where geographic numbers require a local address in the corresponding city of the zone where you want to procure the number, and national numbers need the address of the end user and place of residence of the building where they're going to be used. And these are different, but not really difficult to comply with requirements in and of themselves. They're not hard to comply with. What is hard is knowing that this is the specific detail for Germany, that this is the specific detail for France. And there are umpteen other countries after that where we've got specific detail and information pertaining to what processes and steps need to be followed so that you can obtain a regulatorily compliant service. That's where the difficulty comes in. Collating all of that information from all of these different independent regulatory bodies in all of these different countries and representing it in a clear and concise fashion for enterprises to consume. All of these bits of stuff fall under the moniker of KYC. Now, KYC, know your customers, is not something specific to telecoms. It's afflicted many areas of many things, particularly in the technology realm around the globe, and now it's in telecoms. Effectively, it is the body of work of collecting proof of address and proof of identity, documentation and proofs. We have a responsibility as a supplier to abide by the regulations in the countries where we are selling service access into. And as such, we are required to collect this information and pass this information on to the regulators in the relevant countries. There is a body of work called KYC. Your supplier should be conducting this work. My recommendation would be, ask them about it. Ask them what they're doing. How do they do it? How are you using my data? Think to yourself, when was the last time I submitted any information for a new number that I got in France or Germany? If the answer is, I've never done it, you should be asking your supplier some questions. The question should be, are you compliant? But we'll get on. So we've got a nice checklist at the end that talks you through what you should and shouldn't be asking for. So one of the big drivers, especially in the European continent, is the ISDN switch off. In the UK, it's tabled for 2025, which has been delayed, I think, 5 rounds running for 5 years, every 5 years, delayed by 5 years, but apparently now it's going to happen. In the US, 2022, it's happening effectively. In France, 2023, ISDN is being shut down. Why is this relevant? Why should you care? A lot of the regulations that were written a long, long time ago and were written under the service offering of ISDN, TDM, fully fixed line communications. As such, a lot of the regulations seem a bit weird when you look at them through the lens of a internet service that is magically transmitting itself around the world without any fixed cable being associated with it, which, if you go back 50 years, would seem like magic. So what we are also seeing is regulators doing two things broadly. They're looking at the regulations that they've already got, that they've had for years, and they're saying, wow, we really need to start enforcing these with some gusto because this problem's about to explode, because all of a sudden all of our numbering resources are going to be available to everyone everywhere immediately, rather than only available through a fixed line connection into a data center. That's a fundamental shift for an in-country PSTN provider to get their head around. And then they're saying, well, are these regulations even relevant to VoIP services? Oh, no, they're not. Let's quickly rush into producing some new regulations which are going to cover us and make sure that there are no problems. If we have a look at France, for example, there are some pretty, I won't say extreme, but overbearing requirements, and they are on the stiffer end of complying in a country in order to offer a compliant service. So this is one of the drivers that we're seeing changing the way the regulations look in the telecoms market. And it's also one of the drivers that's pushing enterprises to move away from fixed line telecoms. So you can see that there is some synergies. Synology is the name of it. NAS that I was fiddling with this morning. There are some synergies between the drivers for enterprises to move towards cloud-based services and the drivers for regulators to change their regulations.
All right. Thanks very much, Mehmet. Here's our second question. How has the ISDN shutdown impacted you? And please tell us, are you fully on-prem and planning to stay that way? You transitioned UC to the cloud, but not your contact center. Transitioned contact center, but not UC. You're working on migration with your carrier, or they're shutting down the ISDN? So please tell us which of those best describes you, and we'll give it a couple of minutes. I wonder if Mehmet or Robin, if you could just share. There's been so much talk. I want to go back to the kind of emergency services and Telecom and carries a lot. There's been so much talk about that in the U.S. Are you finding that in countries with these similar emergency services that they're enacting similar kinds of laws, or is the U.S. kind of ahead of the world in that?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and then Mehmet, feel free to. But I think U.S. is definitely more. I'm hearing rumors, and we're hearing more and more around how to improve emergency calling services around the world. I haven't heard of any specific laws that mimic Kerry's Law and Ray-Bombs Act, other than Canada is doing something similar, and so on and so forth. But more around emergency calling services, what I'm hearing is people trying to adopt, or countries trying to adopt, next generation 911 techniques, which by their nature are going to push the industry, the emergency calling industry globally, to do a better job, which is what Kerry's Law and Ray-Bombs Act is trying to do. So generally speaking, I think around the world, we're seeing more and more of that. I think there are really two things that come to mind. One, we're seeing some enterprises take that on. Rather than coming from a regulatory perspective, I'm seeing enterprises go, hey, we want to be good citizens. We want to protect our people. We want to do the right thing. And so they're modeling some of their solutions after Kerry's Law and Ray-Bombs Act. But then from a regulatory perspective and a countrywide perspective, we're seeing more next generation 911 or next generation emergency calling services technologies take fold or take foot and be able to accommodate and provide that similar type of service. But again, I'm not seeing a one-to-one match per se.
Yeah, I certainly agree. On the international, if you look at it globally, right, some key events happened in the US to drive Ray-Bombs Law and Kerry's Act. Ray-Bombs Act, Kerry's Law, get them backwards.
Kerry's Law and Ray-Bombs Act, yeah.
There you go. So there's some specific events, some sad specific events happened that caused these things to come into existence. And in the case of Kerry's Law, that functionality, the ability to reach emergency services without calling for an outside line, dialing line, or whatever, has permeated through. That's the way that everybody dials now. That just because that was an easy way to do it, and everybody got on board, not because it was mandated, it just happened.
Yeah.
Now, the US is certainly ahead of the curve in terms of Rape Arms Act and collecting that real-time location information, but we're starting to see some countries make noises and make movements to be in a similar position or request similar information using similar workflows. And if you have a look at Stir Shaken, for example, often people would say the whole world is watching the US to see how that works, to see whether or not they want to implement it or something else. And we're seeing in France now, they're implementing something similar because they've seen that Stir Shaken is starting to work in the US. Maybe not, who knows? We don't know the rationale behind that. But I would certainly say that in terms of, I'm going to say, almost household name known specific regulatory changes that most enterprises will come across eventually with a name that you'll be able to say, are you this? Are you that? The US is ahead of the curve. Internationally, everything's still just got code reference numbers.
All right. Well, thanks very much. And I'm going to go ahead and push out the responses and again, just turn it back to Mehmet and Robin to discuss and move on.
33% said they're shutting down the ISDN. Okay.
That's interesting. Yeah, they are. They really, really are. It really, really is happening. The impacts are going to be almost invariably that any of you guys that have got ISDN lines stuck into the back of PBXs hanging off walls in offices still, they're not going to work like that anymore. You're going to need a digital transformation plan to transition away from that relatively quickly. In doing so, you'll also recognize some pretty significant efficiency benefits and cost-saving benefits and some flexibility benefits. Hybrid working will just be easy, for example.
You know, what this one thing this tells me is you look at the first line versus the last line. I'm fully on-prem and planning to stay here. And then you got varying degrees of migration, and then, you know, some aspect of I didn't know this was going on. To me, what I read out of this is the fact that the concept of a hybrid network and a hybrid situation, a lot of hybrid stuff, combination of on-prem versus off-prem, combination of different types of network solutions, you know, Cisco versus Teams and so on and so forth. That's not going to go away anytime soon. That's what I'm reading from this.
Mm. And if you look at result number one, just because it's poignant, right? I'm fully on-prem and planning to stay here. 20% quarter of people observing this is saying that. That doesn't mean that the ISDN shutdown doesn't mean that you can't stay on-prem. There are some significant benefits to what is classed as on-prem, which is really just managing your own infrastructure rather than being beholden to some aggregated service provider. You can easily plug in SIP-enabled services into on-prem infrastructures. So there is certainly a modernization path forward for on-prem deployments.
Yeah, cool. Good stuff. All right. So emergency services, kind of my bailiwick, but we're going to talk about this not just from a U.S. perspective, but also from a global perspective and what's going on there. So let's jump right in here. International emergency calling. I'll touch on this, and then Mehmet, please chime in as you've got a lot more experience with this. But really, the way Bandwidth looks at international emergency calling, right, is that this is there's a lot of different things going on, but one key thing to look at this is that how things happen in the U.S. in terms of provisioning or activating emergency services on a line, and how they happen internationally can be quite different, like we've already talked about, and the requirements of them vary significantly from country to country. But roughly speaking, they are the same. You have to activate, you have to provision, you have to set up emergency calling, and then you need to be able to act on that activation and actually process the call itself. So you'll hear me talk about things in terms of provisioning and in terms of things of call routing and being able to route that call. And so a lot of times, right, this is the activation, the provisioning is often a paid service from your provider. and you can bundle that in. In fact, internationally, that's the case, right? Emergency calling becomes a feature of the line you purchase. In the U.S., we have some flexibility in terms of you can purchase, especially with things like, I always love to give examples with things like Microsoft Teams, right? Teams, you can buy your PSTN and your telephony access from one company, and you can buy your E911 access from another company. It's just the way it works. But activating things internationally is like I said, it's broadly the same, but there are some distinctions here. Anything to add, Lament?
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is the international emergency services workflow, way that you use it, almost everything is quite old. It hasn't really changed in a very long time. The workflow is essentially as simple as you acquire a number from your provider. Your provider says, who are you? What's your information? Where should the ambulance go if you should drop dead? You give them a piece of information. They upload that information. It takes 24, 48 hours to get to where it's getting to, which is a non-real-time database. That non-real-time database is polled by the PSAP when an emergency services call is made, and that's where the ambulance goes to. There is no concept at the moment internationally of your actual location because you've decided to work from the other office that your number's allocated to, or you've taken your phone home and you've made a call from that phone. That whole concept isn't really being dealt with internationally yet, but we are seeing it dealt with in the US.
Perfect. Let's drill down here for a second, Mehmet, and talk about the U.S. requirements in particular and what Raybaum's Act and Kerry's Law really means. So the other thing is I'll mention that Raybaum's Act, just a little factoid and a little bit of trivia, is that there's actually the acronym Raybaum stands for something, but it's also named after a guy, Raybaum, and it was actually his birthday earlier this week. So just a little bit of trivia for you. It's one of those interesting laws where the lawmakers got very creative and were able to come up with an acronym that matched somebody's name. It's interesting. But anyway, what Raybaum's Act is all about is requiring a dispatchable location. So when you take 911 calls, and this doesn't just apply to the U.S., it applies globally, right? You can take emergency calls and break them down into different categories. Roughly speaking, I like to break them down into three categories. You've got wireless calls, you've got voice over IP based calls, and you've got good old fashioned ISDN, PSTN based calls. Those are going away, as we talked about a couple slides ago. ISDN, that's going away. But VoIP and wireless are the two big ones. Wireless being the most prominent. But VoIP is still a big issue, and especially with enterprises adopting, new technologies and so forth. The idea behind Raybaum's Act was to say for any what the FCC calls an MLTS, a multi-line telephone system, which is essentially a voice over IP based phone system, you have to deliver a dispatchable location. So what does that mean? That means an address line 1 plus an address line 2. Address line 1 would be your main street, 123 Main Street, whatever the main front door address is. Address line 2 is more granular information that the idea is to help the first responders, whether it's a police officer or law enforcement or an emergency response team, medics and so forth, wherever you are. It's the idea is to get them to the place of the emergency where the phone was that called emergency services, right? And so that address line 2 can be, suite level, floor level, room level information. It's very contextual. It depends on the level. Sometimes, you don't need an address line 2. Single family homes, front door address, we're good. Other times, you need room level information. You need sometimes just floor level information is needed. I work in an office at Bandwidth where we've got a wide open suite, right? So the floor level information is what's needed. As soon as the first responders get off on their floor, they're going to be able to on that floor, my floor, they're going to be able to find the emergency. So there's that level of information that's required, and that's the intent. Now, the interesting thing about this, right, is that Raybaum's Act and the FCC said this is what you have to do. They don't tell us how we have to do it. So that leaves interpretation out there, and so we have a lot of that going on, and I think that feeds into a lot of the confusion and the non-compliance going on. But there is that aspect, and I've got to say, And Matt, we've been a little remiss. We haven't said this yet, which is that I'm not a lawyer. I can't give you legal advice, right? Our lawyers are probably squirming already that we haven't said that. But
neither of us are lawyers. We definitely cannot give you legal advice.
Yeah, we can't give you legal advice. But so one of the key things, and we'll talk about this on the checklist, is consult your own lawyers and figure out, how you implement this, how you work with a bandwidth, how you work with your provider to satisfy these compliance. Make sure you run that by your legal team and make sure you're good to go with that, because we're going to see some lawsuits on this eventually. We've already had some, and we're going to see more, and that's going to help bring some clarity to the industry. Kerry's law is all about. There's two things there. There's several things in Kerry's law. Is that? But the main thing is a notification needs to be delivered. As Mehmet mentioned, a lot of people have handled I don't know if anybody has a problem handling the part of Kerry's law that says you don't need to prepend a call with some sort of access code, right? You need to eliminate that access code to dial emergency services. That's the easy part. The harder part is delivering a notification to a front desk, to a security desk, something like that, so that they can help the first responders find the accident or find the emergency when they show up on scene. So all these things work together. In the U.S., these requirements work together in the FCC regulations for MLTS or multi-line telephone systems. And the bottom line here is these regulations have come and gone, right? We're in the thick of it right now, trying to do it. And so with that, we've got a poll here coming up in a second that we're going to dig into to actually explore this a little bit further. But before we get there, or I guess we're going to get there right now. Perfect. This is a good time. This is going to kind of repeat the poll I talked about several slides ago, but I think now's a good time to do it. I'll hand it back.
Okay, thanks very much, Robin. And the question is essentially the question, I think, from the pie chart you had a while ago, asking it of our audience. Do you have a compliant emergency calling system in place at your work? I didn't know that I had to do this. I can't figure out how to do it. I'm working on it. Or, yes, emergency responders can find my employees. So please tell us about that. And I think you make an interesting point, Robin, that all those dates for compliance have already passed. So in theory, as you say, you're in the thick of it, and it's something that your enterprise should already have hopefully at least been making some progress on. Do you get a sense of maybe why it's been challenging for some enterprises to kind of be aware? Is there not enough information out there, or?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of different aspects that are contributing to that. Everything from there's confusion about the law. I mean, there's when you read the latest regulations, there's some grandfather clauses and stuff like that. So people are going, well, do I really have to do this? So there's confusion around if I have to do it or not. There is just complications in terms of, there's so many projects a lot of people are working on right now. They're moving to the cloud. They're doing this. They're converting phone systems. There's a lot going on. And it's, this is just another project that competes for time and resources within an organization. And so some organizations are going, you know what, I've got a lot going on. We're going to defer this for a little bit until we absolutely have to get there, or maybe until we do get some clarification on exactly what we do. There's dependencies on technology too. These new systems that help people comply with the Ray-Bombs Act. Some of them, bandwidth, we can help you absolutely, but there's some that there needs to be some software upgrades and some upgrades to the systems that need to happen before you can, completely comply with this and make it work. So there's a lot of different reasons that are impacting why companies are not complying yet. And a lot of them I think are quite legit. I think, it's going to be interesting over the coming years, and some of these lawsuits that we see are going to be very interesting.
Got it. Okay. Well, let me pass this along. And this is encouraging, relatively, I guess. It's, again, you pointed out that even 50% isn't as much as you'd like, but our audience at least seems to be ahead of the control group.
Yeah. Obviously, this isn't quite as controlled and scientific as that Metrigy study that we quoted earlier in the presentation, but I am encouraged to see that the trend is moving more towards the yeah, we're good to go. We've got this covered. One thing that's interesting here is I'm also encouraged to see nobody answered, I can't figure out how to do this. So obviously I feel encouraged that maybe I'm doing my job okay, and that word's getting out that this can be done. And so I'm glad to see that. I'm gratified to see that we don't have anybody responding of, I can't figure out how to do this. Cool. All right. Let's get moving on here. So I like to look at a stack type solution here to managing compliance at your organization. I'll make a few comments, and then I'll invite Mehmet to chime in as well and get through this. But really, I like to look at it from a 3-layer cake, or 3 layers of things here. There's the network foundation, there's the stack or the routing piece of your solution, and then there's the applications piece. And I think it's good to look at whether it's emergency services regulations or any of the other types of regulations. All these different perspectives build on each other. You've got to have a network. You got to connect to network and network providers that can be compliant with, whether it's emergency services compliance, or it's other types of compliance, or just, billing compliance. The network foundation needs to be there. And then within the middleware or the communication stack, you need to have that enabled properly. And then there's applications on top of that come into play. Location tracking for emergency services, those types of things that need to come into play, billing applications and so forth, that help you comply with all kinds of all the different aspects. So I think it's useful to break it down into these 3 areas and work from that perspective. What do you want to add, Mehmet?
I just want to reinforce your message, really. I think it's great. Like, any communications use case can be separated out into these 3 layers. Every communications use case, every telecom stack has some network connectivity somewhere, is connecting to the PSDN or a line somewhere at some point. Every communication stack has a logic layer, has a logic component that defines what this thing is. Every communication stack has an interface where the person using it interfaces with the thing that's been built or bought. So as Robin says, map out your communications stack against these items and interrogate it. Interrogate it yourself. What have the providers of this element of my communications stack done to reassure me that it's operating in a regulatorily compliant fashion? If the answer is, well, nothing really yet, or I haven't heard from them in a while, or something that sounds like that, just give them a call. Ask them the question. Ask them, what are you doing to ensure that in as many aspects as you're aware, the service that you're providing is regulatorily compliant? And they should be able to give you a fairly convincing answer. If not, then you need to start consulting some industry experts and finally some lawyers to inform you on what you should be doing next, because we are not lawyers.
There you go. Why don't we, you want to start off with this list and then we can get to some questions?
Yeah, so this list started in another webinar that we did a couple of months back, and it's really the thing that somebody should be taking a screenshot of. If you wanted to capture one element of this presentation that will help you understand what you need to do next, just take a screenshot of this. It means you don't have to go back and watch the 1 hour recording or go through 20 or 30 or so slides to find it, but this is the one to take a photograph of or a screenshot. Consult with your legal counsel about the regulations that may impact you. As we've said 3 times now, we're not lawyers. Consult with your legal counsel on this. They will tell you what needs to be done. They will give you their interpretation of what the regulations are, and they will be able to translate those regulations into actionable items for your specific enterprise. Because although the regulations are broadly set and the same for everybody, the way that certain enterprises interpret them can be different. And there certainly are instances where enterprises have sought special dispensation for some reason or another, for some aspect of something from an in-country regulator and succeeded. That might be you. This is why you need to consult with your legal counsel first. Learn about the compliance requirements in the countries that you're operating in. Wherever you are operating, wherever you are planning to operate, understand that there are regulatory compliance aspects that you have to comply with. There are no regions where there is nothing. So if you've done nothing in some regions where you are operating and you've not had to submit any information, it's probably worth doubling back and just making sure that that is in a compliant fashion. Find a carrier that understands and has the resources dedicated to help you implement this. Don't want to point fingers, but bandwidth can do that. Find a carrier that has truly got the global experience and knows these regulations and has got direct lines of communications with the regulators as we do, and hears the regulatory changes as they happen as we do, and is willing to communicate those to you with transparency, without delay, and without bias. That's going to stand you in really good stead, because what we see is a rapidly changing regulatory environment for telecoms. Troubleshoot and test your emergency capabilities with hybrid employees. I can see a question knocking around in the chat that talks about this, and we will get to the questions in a moment. But have a look at your emergency services flow. Make sure that it is in compliance with the compliance requirements of the countries that you're talking about. If we're talking about the US, there are some pretty strict requirements there now. So make sure that you're compliant with those. As we just covered off, map out know your customer flows against your requirements and make sure that you're compliant at every layer of the stack. Understand the data submission requirements for each country you're operating in. Each country, as we discussed for France and Germany, each country's got a specific list of things that you need to provide. Not every country is the same. There is no broad rule that says it has to be document A in format B, and then you'll be all right for all countries. Familiarize yourself with the information requirements in those countries, and you'll be ahead of the game. Set up access to emergency services where you're required. In most countries, well, in Europe, a provider providing inbound and outbound services to an end user is required to enable emergency services. So we, bandwidth supplying an enterprise in Europe, need to enable emergency services. Make yourself aware where this is the case.
Perfect. And I'm gonna tag on to your last point there and try and answer one of the questions that I see in the Q&A, which is, I just want to reiterate exactly what you said. If you can, most countries, but particularly in the US, if you do inbound, outbound services, the way the litmus test I like to throw out there is if the phone can call out to the PSTN. So one of the questions is all about, what about work from home? Can we assign, do we need to enable emergency services from work from home? Again, not a lawyer. I'm not giving legal advice here. I'm telling you what I see in the marketplace. If that phone can dial out to the phone network, it needs to be able to dial 911. So it doesn't matter if it's a soft phone that's normally at work. You want it at home. In the instance of an emergency, you need to be able to pick up any phone device and call 911. And you want it to go to the right public safety answering point. In the U.S. particularly, it needs to go to your local answering point. I mean, I can talk about this all day long. I think there's aspects of this that are critical. So yes, I think the work from home scenario, you need to enable it. If that Teams client on a laptop can call out using the phone system, it needs to be properly configured to call 911. You're going to be in a much better position, because you don't want to be in that position where they tried to call 911. It didn't happen. You go, well, they're not going to use that phone to call 911. We don't know that. And that's what the FCC leans on. The FCC says, you know what? Doesn't matter. It needs to be able to reach out to the right 911 call center. So your safe harbor is to 911 enable it. Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to us droll on a bit about regulations.